Hello, I'm Ali Cameron and I run a small commercial archaeology company in Aberdeenshire. I also do community projects in the area. So today I want to just tell you a little bit about sort of my personal view of community projects, talking about where we get the money, who takes part, and under what circumstances. Um, so this is just a few pictures from some of the fantastic projects that I've been involved in, and obviously I'll tell you a bit more about these as we go along. So there's lots of questions about community archaeology, and they're all done differently. So if you're looking at a project, you want to know whether people will provide you accommodation, for example. It's a basic thing that when you get somewhere, you either want to be taken home at night, which obviously we can do, or you want to have somewhere to stay. So this is sort of two pictures, actually slightly different projects. The bottom one at the Cabrach in Aberdeenshire near Huntly, where the client provided us with this house, and then they just sort of left us. Well, and they also provided us with a Tesco delivery. Um, and so there was plenty of rooms for us all to sort of bunk down and loads of food. Um, and then at the top, some of students from your previous years who are setting up a tent in what looks like a muddy field. They actually really enjoyed themselves. It was fine, but you have to think about the weather, of course. You know that we don't want people camping and tents blowing away, and um, so there will be a variety of different situations that occur during these community projects. Do we provide transport? Well, you can cost in minibuses into projects. Um, when I go out from Aberdeen, for example, to projects, I'll fill my car up with people, but that's only four other people, and we try to get um, people to car share, out to projects. A lot of the older volunteers, of course, have a car, and so will car share. Um, but often, if you're going in the middle of nowhere, it's really the most motivated volunteers, who are either quick to bag a lift or get there on their own. You can take buses and trains obviously to places, but a lot of our digs are out slightly in the middle of nowhere, so you often do need, as a student you will have been provided a minibus to a dig. That often isn't the case, on other projects. Things like welfare facilities, and again, that's very mixed. That obviously we try to provide something for people. So in this case, there's a portaloo in a cabin on the right here, and then this van here is somebody's private van, which we don't really use. But on a dig like this where it's really sunny, everybody sits outside. If it suddenly starts to rain and you've got 30 people, 30, 40 people, you only get a dozen into that cabin. So you have to sometimes be prepared for awful weather. Those of you who've been on digs know that particularly in Aberdeenshire it can be a bit wild. So we have been into the woods. There's some woods here, you can go in there and stand. Um, but if you've got very young volunteers, you can't have them outside for a long time doing nothing or sitting around because they get cold. So, and we do have a lot of different ages. So in this picture, I think you've got 80 down to, well, that'd be 20s, but we know we have a lot of children who come, and I'll tell you a bit more about that later. And generally, there's no requirements for you to come on the dig, that you don't have to have had experience, although most of the people in this picture have. And if you're less fit, for example, which a number of volunteers are, there's lots of work with fines. And again, I'll talk a bit more about that later. And then training. So most digs train in some way. Often this is um, not a specifically organised training, but that whoever you have on the dig will share skills with you. So on a very wet day here, we got a dumpy level, and I trained some of them to use it, and then you can see, well, one of your ex-students here, then training other people. So if you learn something and then teach somebody else, that's a fantastic ad hoc way of learning. And we do more formal training as well, depending on who is involved in the excavations and what they want to learn. You can see here this is a mixture of archaeology students and interested older volunteers. You don't necessarily have to want to be an archaeologist for a living to want to learn to know what a dumpy level does. And things like machine watching, so very basic skills, it would seem to people who have been archaeologists for a long time, but actually learning about watching an excavator clearing ground, what level you go to. And this is a couple of former Aberdeen postgraduate students now, a few years ago, doing some machine watching on a community excavation. And drawing, photography, supervision, site interpretation, and as I say, often an experienced volunteer will train others, so that this would appear, well, on the right, an Aberdeen archaeology student who's doing quite intensive learning about a particular stratigraphy and feature, but on the left, an experienced volunteer training a less experienced volunteer in drawing. And to be honest, that's such a great thing to see, that when you see a volunteer who hasn't really done archaeological drawing and they just take to it, it really is a fantastic experience, that. And for me as a director, I then know some of the students and volunteers who then can take that and train other people. So as a director, you have to be on top of all that. Who's confident doing something, who isn't confident, who's obviously new to something, and you're mixing those people together all the time. And as I said, if you're less able to do matching for 8 hours a day, on the left you have finds groups. So this is a more experienced finds person, Sheila, training some of the others. Obviously, every find is checked, bagged, sorted. If you have less experienced volunteers, you get a finds tray. These green trays here full of stones, of course, and we don't always have time every day to go through every tray, and so that's their job, is then to whittle out the stones from the interesting stones, like gaming counters. So these this is two former Aberdeen and postgraduate students who are playing this Nefertafel game, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. And also, again, this is on the right, a PhD student in Aberdeen, but I turned up back at site. She was doing site tours at lunchtime while I was having a quick lunch, and I came back and she was talking French to these four people, and so I didn't know that she was completely fluent in French, including knowing the names of colours of archaeological layers and names of features in French. So these four people were just entranced by this. I mean, they can speak English, but to have a tour of a particularly, site with post holes and different colours in French, and so I got chatting to them, and I took photographs of them, and it was such a fantastic experience for them, and obviously the volunteers enjoyed it too. We have sites for students who can train, so doing data structure reports, reports obviously on things that they excavate. So these are two Aberdeen or former Aberdeen students who are getting experience excavating a post hole, for example. And if you haven't done lots of excavation, something like this, it's very technical, the way that it's got to be excavated, the way it's got to be recorded, and digging a test pit here as well, which when the sun keeps coming out, when you want to take your photograph, you have to learn to be patient as well. And we have skills passports, so these are produced, and we sign these for all the students who are taking part. This one here I like because I was signing it in 19, but Hugo Anderson Weimark, which if you don't know, he's a big flint and stone specialist who works in the National Museum of Scotland, who I worked with at the Nessa Brodgar. He had signed it before me, so I was pleased to sign this. But you get all your different supervisors for different projects, not just digging, obviously all sorts of other things, anything archaeological that can be signed off, and you get an idea of whether you're improving in, the quality of the work, and you keep a list of all your projects that you've been on, so it will produce your CV at the end of it. And we do a lot of work with children on these community projects. So school classes will come. So on some digs, every morning a school class. We've had up to 99 primary 6 pupils on one day at a project. We also have Young Archaeologist Club, and this is the Young Archaeologist Club working at the site at Aden, clearing around a big cut mark stone And so you as students and any volunteer who wants to get involved in this working with the children can do that. So we have people who work with children most of the time, and they will then take other people into that group, obviously. And it is quite a skill too, because the kids are saying, they come up to you, what's this? It's a stone. What's this? It's a stone. But obviously on the one occasion out of 30 that it's actually a flint or something else, you've got to be, you don't just keep saying stone, because it will be something one time. And some of the kids are so keen, that you need to be keen too. So it can be incredibly tiring, a couple of hours with the school classes, if you're not used to it. You've got to keep them entertained. You've got to make sure they don't dig too deeply, because they tend to be a bit rabbitish, so they'll burrow down. So you have to make sure that you're on top of what they're doing all the time. And that's not for everybody, but it's good to have a go, on a dig, to see what it's like to, keep a school class entertained. We obviously give them a talk. So again, this is our volunteers who, will talk about the dig. You can see the dig obviously in the background. And what we did with this site was to machine off the grass off a slightly bigger area than we were intending to excavate, and then let them dig down. And so actually during that dig, they did actually dig down onto the archaeological features below, and found flints and all sorts of different things on that dig. We do other specialist training. So on the left is James Dilly, who runs Ancient Crafts, and he came up from the south of England for a couple of days to run some open days with volunteers and members of the public. And so we did flint knapping, pottery, metal rope, Neolithic music, all sorts of different things. And at the end of one of the days, all the volunteers on the dig got to have a go at flint knapping if they wanted, and it was fantastic. I mean, I've done it before with him. We did it in the Mesolithic with another group. This is in the Neolithic. It's very specific. He'll teach you how to knap a flint of a particular period. So if you have money as a project to bring in somebody like him, that is absolutely the thing to do. Something related to the dig that you're doing, and with a specialist like that. And I think he had about 30 volunteers, surrounding him during that event. And it was fantastic. Well, the noises as well, the flint clicking together is just incredible. And some people bring their own tools, for example. So this is a couple of the older volunteers who like to bring with them things that they need, because often on a community dig, you've got 50 buckets, but several of them don't have handles, or so yeah, it's sometimes a bit more makeshift on these. But if you bring your own things, then you look after them, then you know that they're there. So if you need a seat on a site like this to draw a section, then you bring one with you. But basic tools are usually provided on a dig. So if you're going on one, just check what you need to bring, and the director will let you know. And as I said about ages, they're very, very varied. So you have to take that into account. Obviously, the little ones, when they come, this was a family day, and so we got permission to take some photographs of some of the children. 2 kids carrying a little bucket, whereas some of the older volunteers need a snooze at lunchtime. So it's very rude to take pictures of them, but she didn't mind. And obviously, as part of that, you get people to fill in a form where you obviously have their things like their emergency contact details, and to keep in touch with them as well. So you get their email address, and any medical conditions that they have, and you keep that confidentially in a folder in case something happens, and you need the information. And of course, we work in all weathers. So again, this was at Aden, where we just had incessant rain for a few days, and it's very clayey. And to be honest, people who come out on these digs are so motivated and dress really well. So you just have to be prepared on these community digs, because there's not time pressure in the same way as there might be on a commercial dig. We obviously do have half days sometimes, and so that's just playing that by ear and seeing how people are feeling. But generally, people just want to carry on, and if it's safe to do so, then we do. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of the projects that I've been involved in the local area, in which some of Aberdeen University students have been to. So the Book of Deer project, I'll talk a little bit about that what it is in a minute. But essentially, we've got of one of the years that we did the excavation. This is the sort of rundown of the ages of the people that actually volunteered. This is not the school kids, but just the actual people who came along. Most people lived in Aberdeenshire, although a few people, would come from afar. And on this particular excavation, 30% of people, it was their first dig. So people might just come for a day or a couple of days. But to be honest, most people, once they come for a day, they say, I'm really busy. And then they suddenly find a few more days that they can come, because most people really, really enjoyed it. Um, and so when you're looking at funding, one of the things that you need to look at is, that people of all ages and abilities can take part. So, there's all sorts of different things that you can do for people. Not everybody wants to dig, although a lot of people like digging for an hour or two and then doing something else. Getting sort of late mid-teens and early 20s involved, and not necessarily archaeology students, because you're all motivated anyway, but they're traditionally groups of people who don't take part in heritage projects, and so getting them involved. So you could do that by things like getting involved with community groups, young people's community groups, young farmers and things like that, groups that generally are attractive to 20-year-olds, for example. Obviously involving schools, local community groups and things like that. It's really difficult to get secondary schools involved because of the core timetabling, that this does not fit in with an awful lot of things. It should do, but they're so busy. And so it tends to be special needs groups from secondary schools and primary schools, of course, are so keen to come. And of course, volunteering is so good for your health. So getting fit, your mental health, chatting to people who have similar interests to you. I mean, there's always laughing on my projects. Goodness me, there's a tea break. People just get together, and people who haven't chatted before, will sit next to each other. So it's very social, meeting new people. And obviously learning about the past as well. And a lot of people come into the projects with an interest in the past. And then end up texting me and saying, "Oh, can you recommend some books for me to read?" Because they've become hooked on it. So who funds a project? So the Book of Deer project, for example, was privately funded by a local businessman. It was funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund, or now the National Lottery Fund. And there's also group fundraising, student raising funding for a PhD, for example, and a donated amount, so crowdfunding of different sorts. So at the moment we're raising funding for a big excavation in 2022. So we are hoping to get that and be able to bring the Book of Deer back and to Aberdeenshire. So the Book of Deer is a committee, and the book is in Cambridge University Library, and it has got last slide. It has got a section in Latin, the Gospels, and then the earliest known written Gaelic, Scots Gaelic. And so the Gaelic was written in a monastery in Aberdeenshire somewhere, and so the committee decided that they wanted to look for that monastery. And so they set up this committee, which has got around 15 members, and they had little fundraising experience. They'd worked with archaeologists in 2008, and I got involved in 2014. So part of my work as the archaeologist for the project was training and informing the committee. So we discussed obviously what they wanted to find, what they wanted to do, how they wanted to do it. And then obviously I brought in then my experience of archaeological knowledge plus a lot of volunteers. And what we're looking for is a monastery built around 800, 900. I mean, we don't really know. There is a description of the monastery in the Book of Deer written in the Gaelic, but it's very sketchy about what it is. Deer Abbey was built in 1219, and it replaced the monastery. We know that, well, we don't know what it was made from, wood or stone, but probably a combination of both. We don't know how many buildings, how many monks, and of course we don't know where it was located. So one of the strategies that I brought in was community walkovers. So groups of local people, I would go out and meet them, and we would walk over fields, hills, We would look at maps to see if there were any known place. There's this chapel field, for example. We went there. It doesn't seem very likely. We were looking for places that had water source, wood, a good sort of flattish ground. And we also started then doing test pitting. So one excavation a year, which had lots and lots of volunteers involved in it in different places. This is the community walkovers. So this was a very, very wet day, and we were checking out lots of lumps and bumps in woods, and that's really good for the group because they see what it means to look for archaeology. You know that you don't go to a site and excavate something and find it. You know that this is something that's much more elusive than that. And then this test pitting, this community activity, which was fantastic. We went and we knocked on all the doors in Old Deer, and everybody who answered, we asked them if we could dig a test pit in their garden. This family here who live in the village, when I knocked on the door, the young girl came to the door who was about 8, and she said, "Oh, you're the archaeology wifey." And she had been in a class and come to one of my digs. And so she said to her mum, "Oh, we have to dig a test pit in our garden." So we ended up digging 2 or 3 test pits in their garden with their family, extended family, and our volunteers. We didn't actually find anything very old because by the time we'd gone down about, less than a metre to the depth that we could really go to safely, we'd only found things back to like 1800s. And so there's a lot of buildup of soil, later soil. But it was a fantastic project, and people, came into the garden and chatted, and it was a nice community thing. We let people know when the dig was going on, and people came to chat to us. And so this is Old Deer, and this is all the test pits that we've excavated. So the green in here were done by Guard Archaeology, the blue ones here done by Murray Archaeological Services, and then all the rest were excavated by me and the team and the volunteers. So you can see it in people's gardens, in the churchyard here. So this is a medieval church. And a lot of the community group thought that the monastery would be in this churchyard. There's a river running here, there's sort of a crook in the river. And so we did excavate quite a number of trenches in the graveyard, like these ones, which was absolutely fantastic. We found a bit of the wall of the medieval church which had been demolished, which we knew was there, but checking out levels. And so this is that on the left here, so we're recording that. Thousands of finds, pottery, glass, things to do with the church and the building, also brought in soil probably from somewhere else to raise the level, and of course a huge number of human bones. And this was great training for the volunteers. We went through all the finds, we sorted them out into different pottery types. We had human bones, well, I'm a human bone specialist, and others who came in, and we sorted all the bones out so you could have a lesson in recording human bones. And so it was a fantastic project, but it did not take us to the monastery. So I decided in 2018 that we would try a slightly different strategy, and that we would look at Deer Abbey, which is the 1219 Abbey, and we would look at the area round about it and see if there was any way that the monastery had been quite near to it. And this was because when I went into this field, there's a platform here, which then slopes down to the river. Down here, you can see the South Ugi water here. And so we got geophysics. So the project paid for geophysical survey. So this is Deer Abbey. This is the ground penetration radar. We got scheduled monument consent. The more interesting bit was around about the Abbey. You can see the Abbey again here. In this flat area here that I was talking about, there was many anomalies that had been shown with the geophysics. And so we went in and we excavated some areas in there. We filmed it, so we had BBC Alba in 2017, and then Nescol and Northern College in 2018. And this was great because the volunteers got a chance to be on camera, and that's something that if you're going to be an archaeologist, though you will have a news story at some time and you will be on camera, and so talking to the press. And so we found a lovely hearth, which we excavated with a ditch round about it with stake holes in it. So the hearth has been surrounded by like a wattle structure. This is the hearth, and you can see the dates here, nice earlyish dates here, suggesting we might be in we're in the monastery period. The ditch you can see here, and also a path next to it. And the path we had in the bedding layer, we had a date of 1041 to 1211. So again, pre-Dear Abbey, so in the monastery period, so in that earlier period. And Jan Dunbar, who's an archaeological illustrator in Aberdeenshire, created this drawing showing the hearth in use with the wattle screen round about it. There was slag, and so we wondered if it was the metalworking area of the monastery. And in 2018, we did a bigger excavation. We had 80 volunteers, 20 young archaeologists, 13 primary and secondary classes, totaling that many. And so altogether, 431 people took part in the excavation. And we found a lot of structures. We've got a stone structure, we've got post hole structures here, and we think up to 5 structures in one. And in this post hole here, which was excavated, we have a date of 669 to 777 AD. So we're definitely in the monastery period here. We've got all these structures. Now what we need to do is we need to come back and excavate a much bigger area. These small trenches are fantastic, but we need to create a fund now to strip and map this whole area and see if this is actually the monastery. And so that's what we're working on. One of the things that we found in the soil above this structure is a gaming board. We don't know if exactly what date this is, but it was found in the soil above that very early building. And it's for games like Nefertafel, these strategy games, and you can see here what it might have looked like. The stone had been cut down into a circle, like a pot lid, eventually. But that was what it would have looked like when it had been complete. And also on the side of it, there's this wonderful decoration, which is called a Solomon knot. And it's supposed to be a sign to ward off the devil. So it's a medieval graffiti. And when people were asked after the dig about, for the Heritage Lottery Fund, we got feedback. We had some fantastic feedback. People just really enjoyed it. They enjoyed the company. That dig was actually really hot, so people needed we provided ice lollies one day. They needed cooling down because it was so hot, and that's quite unusual in Aberdeenshire. But people just really like working with different people. After the dig, we did a museum setup, and again we did that with students and volunteers. I sort of decided what we would display, and then with a group of us, set about creating boards and displaying it. And another project that I've been involved in at Adden Country Park is actually adjacent to the Book of Deer's site, and so they're very, very closely related. And I've been doing excavations in the park since 2017. Funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund, Historic Environment Scotland, Friends of Adden, Aberdeenshire Council Archaeology Service. And several sites were brought to our attention by interested locals who have been walking the park for a long time. And so part of the excavation work, or the archaeological project, was to look at things like these huge stones which were in the park. It is an area of very huge stones, but this one here appeared to be a recumbent stone from a stone circle, which had been dumped into a ditch. And we know that there'd been a lot of stone moving because a lot of the park had been set out as fields. So this was actually Neil Ackerman, who at that time worked for Aberdeenshire Council Archaeology Service, and he came out and we talked to Adden Welfare about the stone circle, and they see no reason why it wasn't a recumbent, but we can't prove that it was. And as you can see, it's actually trapped by a tree growing over it now. But what we did as part of the work with the volunteers was to walk all of the fields and the forestry. And so we looked at every large stone like that, and any that we could see were not sitting on the surface or that were interesting, we dug a little trench next to it, and we tried to see if there was a stone circle in evidence. We could find no other evidence that there was one, apart from these very large stones. So at the moment we've left it that there may have been a stone circle in the area, but we haven't found it yet. But one of the volunteers had noticed this cut mark on top of a really large earth fast. Now, this is an interesting earth fast because, like many, people have tried to split it down the fault lines. There's chisel marks on it, but we feel that that's quite a good probable cut mark. And so in the field where that stands, that stone, we did field walking to start with the volunteers, and we found nearly 300 early to late Neolithic flints just in field walking on one day in that field. And so we carried out some geophysical survey, which actually there's a lot of rig and furrow and all sorts of things going on, so it wasn't easy to see anything. But we started off by doing some strip trenches, so you're putting in machine trenches, and we found that first year 3 post holes, so the bases of 3 post holes. So you can see here this sort of circularish area, we've cut that in half, associated with quite a number more Neolithic flints. And eventually we opened out a huge trench, 50 by 40 metres, and found what we think is a Neolithic structure, which is at least 25 metres long and 11 to 12 metres wide. You can see one edge of it. This was where we started out. These are our earliest post holes, but you can see here that there's some structure in here. It gets a little fuzzy around here, but you can see that there's lines of post holes coming off here and here, which may be entrances. These stones here are earth fast, so big stones that are set into the, that have never moved geologically, and so are sort of set and maybe form part of the structure. But we also found tree throws, so where trees have been and fallen over, and so we think it's likely that there were trees built in, or this enclosure had been built around living trees. And this is something that's been found in other parts of Scotland. What we don't have yet is great dating evidence. So for this site, we're waiting for dates to come through, because these post holes have been very badly disturbed by ploughing, later activity. We're waiting we've now got some wood that has come from some of the post holes that we're having dated at this very minute. And this is what some of them look like. So you've got some slightly more classic post holes here, but quite a lot really enigmatic, sort of these earth fast, these erratic boulders, that have rolled down and landed in this field. And this one was very, very odd, that it appeared to maybe have had posts pushed into bits of it. But that's really difficult to tell. And so here, yes, lots of archaeology students and volunteers, lots of enigmatic features and head scratching, which is actually fantastic for training, because not all archaeology is easy to interpret or understand. And so that actually makes you realise that, there's a lot of thinking to do. And again, at this site, lots of young archaeologists in classes, terribly wet some days, but the kids in the local area, so the feeders to Mintlaw Academy, absolutely adore. They love being outside. We had lots of activities for them to do. We knew it was going to be quite a wet week, and so we had a few indoor things, so colouring sheets, jigsaws with different sort of, archaeologically related images. And again, Jan Dunbar has created this image, which is of what the enclosure might have looked like. So she has set it as an excavation enclosure, with a body being allowed to rot, and fox and crows, and she has painted some of the posts. These posts were not enormous. They were not structural like for a house. There was never a roof, but they were much smaller posts, and so we wonder if these were put in over quite a long period of time, and no reason why they wouldn't have been decorated. And whether they're for the local community to celebrate, to hold events, and what each post meant, we wouldn't be quite sure. But it's certainly a very exciting site. So a number of problems with it, in that it's very, very difficult to date. What else could it be if it wasn't a Neolithic enclosure, with all of those finds associated with it? And again, we're hoping to do some further excavation. Obviously, there are times when community excavations can't take place, in times like COVID-19, for example. And so in times like that, community excavations just are put on hold, and so they'll be carried on after the pandemic is over. We excavate a number of different sites in Arden, different periods. This late 16th century building, which had initially been walked over by archaeologists who thought it was much, much later than that. It was a farming, farmstead. But when we excavated it, we realised that it was much more exciting than that. And it's this T-shaped building. You've got a door at the north, you've got doors at each end, and 2 doors in the south wall. This is we had 3D photography done by a company, and this fantastic image of it. This is wonderful thing around that it's in trees, and so these are actually the remains of the trees around the outside of it. This is the 3D photography being carried out. And so the doors here, you can see the door with a threshold here, a few cobbles still in place, enormous, great big stones for the jambs of the door. Here's another view of that same door here. And finds, very interesting finds, lots of coins, mostly 1700s coins, 17th century brooch here. This is both sides of the same copper alloy brooch. And spectacles, 16th to 17th century spectacles. This was one example. You can see one lens with the copper alloy roundabout and the nose piece here. And we found at least three lots of spectacles. And a lot of glass, a lot of which was burnt and fused and heated in 2 phases of glass, late 16th, early 17th and mid 17th century. So it looks like the building may have been built in the 16th century and then glazed in the 17th century. This building, and also wood on the floor, which we had dated to the sort of 18th to very early 19th century. And we do not know what this building is, but there was a rumour that it was an Episcopalian meeting house, and that may have been burnt down in 1746 by the Duke of Cumberland. The original use of the building may have been something like a tower house. This was one of our volunteers who got his son, who's an architect, to do this possible reconstruction of it. But when we actually looked at the building itself, it appeared more to be a 1-story building, and therefore probably had been an old chapel that just has no maps of it have survived. And then another really quite exciting excavation, we got reported to us by a dog walker. There were all these lumps and bumps in the woods next to the caravan park up here in Aden. And we went, this is photography with a very tall stick, with a camera on the top of it, because this is a very difficult area to photograph. But what we did with archaeology students and volunteers was to do a plane table survey. And once we had done that, we came up with the woodland, which looks like this. There's large oval banks and ditches, circular ones, and these small circular banks and ditches, and this almost butterfly-shaped one. And so we excavated them, and we found that underneath them were finds of 19th century. And so these are much later features, and we think that they were for training military. In the press in the late 19th century, there's stories about lots of army volunteers getting together to train in these estates, including Aden, and we think that they were built in the late 19th and early 20th century as training for army volunteers. And this was a fantastic. We had actually an ex-army volunteer who would take the kids, in groups. We would all take the kids around the different features, and he gave them a stick and he asked them to defend this structure. And goodness, they had a great time. They really did. It was so the volunteers really make a project, bringing their experience into projects. And this is one of the older groups of kids. We get them obviously to do excavation. We get them to do planning and recording. You can't just dig something. It's got all got to be recorded. And we also get them to do paperwork. So they do context sheets, and they try doing drawing. So different finds, and they really enjoy that. And then just very briefly at the end, I'm involved in a group called Mesolithic Deeside who do field walking all along the River Dee. And it's a slightly different project. I'm a volunteer on it, rather than a paid archaeologist. And we work really hard to get small amounts of money to allow us to carry out the work that we do. The actual field walking doesn't cost, or cost very, very little. We need, so some of the volunteers, we need GPSs, we need bags and marker pens, but very, very little else. We arrange to meet on a particular day, and we all walk up a field 2 meters apart, and we find lots and lots and lots of lithics. We do training for our members, so official training, because this is a very specialist area. So this is Anne Clark, who's a lithic specialist based in East Lothian, and she comes up for weekends and trains the volunteers to know what to pick up, what things are, so how old they are, what they are, and we discuss with her whereabouts we're going to field walk as well. And with the group, we've put on exhibitions. So this is Banbury Museum. We did a window display. When we got there, our little team of volunteers who could turn up on the day, we got all the finds with us and all these lovely images. And we were chatting, and one of our volunteers here said, "Oh, I used to be a window dresser in a shop." And we were like, brilliant. So we threw her into the window and she started arranging everything. You can see here we've got woolly gloves and all sorts of different things that we would need. You know, we need to do this because it's always done in the winter, this field walking, so it's always cold. And also another project that I've been involved in, gravestone recording, and this is an ongoing project that we're uncovering gravestones that have been recorded in the past, so in the 20th century, but we uncover them again using suitable tools, obviously wood and brushes, and then recording the inscriptions and photographing them. And so these sorts of projects are going on when COVID is not rampant. These projects are going on all over the place, and so, you know, if you want to get involved in these projects, there are lots and lots of different ones. And we do things like public engagement. Groups of archaeologists will go to shows, Banbury Show or Boyne Games, and do different activities. And so that's how you know, all the sorts of projects you can get involved in as a volunteer. I mean, volunteering within commercial archaeology is something that's really being discussed at the moment, that a lot of people think volunteers should be allowed within community archaeology. At the moment, you know, they should not take the place of a paid archaeologist. And so that's actually being discussed at the moment, and I'm sure that will develop. There's obviously all sorts of health and safety aspects of it, but that'll be something maybe some of you will deal with in your careers. And one thing to always remember as part of community projects is that you must acknowledge the funders, and the volunteers as well. And so for this talk, these funders have obviously funded the projects. Historic Environment Scotland, when they're involved in a project, they fund dates and they fund a publication. Aberdeenshire Council Archaeology Service, I mean, do not have huge amounts of money, but will contribute. And the National Lottery is one of the main funders of archaeological excavation and projects within Scotland at the moment. And so they are always worth a really good application to them. And so that's it. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can Google me, Cameron Archaeology, and